So if I remember right, where we left off, at least last Thursday, is I left you with a thought project of whether or not you would cuddle with a cute dog. There's some people who don't like dogs, so they'd be perfectly okay with this. But then to strap it up to a device and shock it with 450 volts. And I left with that question because I think everyone, or most everyone, said no, or some might say, well, I might shock them a little. Some people may have used shock collars. They're, somewhat effective. But for the most part, I think that the majority of people would say absolutely not, um, and would even be repulsed by the idea. Okay. But let's see if your moral and ethical ideas can be transformed by the situation rather than who you are as a person. And that's kind of what we'll kind of look at when we're looking at social influence. Okay. So, and we watched a video, I believe it was last Thursday, that kind of introduced this idea of social influence. And it's just a myriad of ways that people impact things like our attitudes, our feelings, our beliefs, and our behaviors. Um, and the important part about social influence is that it can be imagined or it can be real. Okay. The best example of probably social influence is especially in rural Arizona, and there's one traffic light and it's 2 a.m. in the morning and it's red. I think the majority of us still stop at that red light, even though there's no other cars around, because we have the imagined idea that someone might be looking, someone might see what's happening. And so a lot of times we commit behaviors not when there's actually anyone who can see it, but because we think of what if. Okay. And so those are some kind of things to kind of keep in mind when we're kind of looking at this. Social influence was first studied, at least from a laboratory perspective, by a gentleman named Sharif. Okay, and if you remember, Sharif, when we talked about prejudice and conflict, he did the Robert Caves experiment. But his original experiment is how much does something that really doesn't in the end have much meaning, how much can it be influenced by just the presence or the opinions of other people? Okay. And so there is an effect. Okay. If we darken the room and we put, those laser pointers and we made it stable. Okay. So it wouldn't move, it wouldn't do anything on its own. Okay. And we had you just focus on that laser pointer. Okay. After a little bit of time, without you moving your eyes and without the laser moving, it will start to move in different directions. Okay. This is what's known as the autokinetic effect. What's actually happening is when you're focusing on that beam of light, the sensory cells that are focusing on that light kind of burn out for a few seconds. And so to pick up the signal, the sensory cells next to it start to fire. Okay. So visually, your brain thinks that the light is moving because different cells are firing to the stimulus. The interesting thing about the autokinetic effect is there's no like preciseness to it. For some people, they might only see it move like a millimeter or a centimeter. For other people, they may see it move 4, 6 inches. Um, but it's really kind of, there's no like standardized, everyone will see it move 2 inches up and down or whatnot. So it's really an individual experience. And when we test people, we get varied responses across groups. Okay. But what Sharif found is that let's say he had a person working for the experimenter. We call these people Confederates. And Confederates, so we have this person that we tell them when they do the experiment in front of the participant, tell them it moved 2 inches, or it moved 1 inch, or it moved just a standard amount. Okay. And what we found is even though we know everyone has an individual experience of how much the light actually moved, the majority of the participants would give the answer that the person that just experienced it gave, because it's kind of a not sure situation. What is 2 inches? What is 3 inches? Those kinds of things. And you're just sitting there seeing this light bouncing everywhere. And it's kind of ambiguous what you think. Okay. And so they're more likely to use the information that someone else said to give their answer. Okay. So what we found is the autokinetic effect, the differences between people come less and less when someone else gives their answer first. All right. Now that's common in ambiguous situations, right? Where you're not sure what the answer is. You're kind of, what am I seeing? Those kinds of things. And we tend to do what's called informational social influence. We're like, is this what we're supposed to be experiencing? Kind of to kind of reduce that ambiguity. All right. Um, well, this is an ambiguous situation. So probably the most famous studies in social influence are what's called the Ash studies. Okay, Ash came along and he said, that's an ambiguous thing. That's something, that there's no precision, there's no fixed answer. And so, sure, you'll listen to someone else and maybe use their experience to tell you. But what if we put in a situation where there's an obvious answer? All right. And so in this study, and I think I mentioned this one in this class before, he had series of cards. And on one card, there was what's called a standard line. And on the other card, it gave 3, 5, or 6 different lines. Okay. And it's a simple task. Which line on the comparison line card matches the standard line? Okay. If I do this right, the correct answer, I believe, would be 2, because this one's a little shorter and this one's quite a bit shorter, 1 and 3, right? So the answer, the correct one in this situation would be 2, all right? And what Ash wanted to know is what would someone state if they were provided with the wrong answer when there was obviously a right answer? So what he did is, again, he employed Confederates, and he'd have anywhere between 3 to 6, and then the participant would be the last person. Okay, so you're coming into this experiment, there's already 3 to 5, 6 people there, and so you just sit on the end table. Okay, and he would go through a list of cards, and for quite a bit of the time, he might have them give the correct answer, but at one point, either in the beginning, middle, or end of telling the line lengths, the Confederates all give the wrong answer. Okay. And in that situation, even though the answer is very obvious, this isn't an ambiguous thing. Oh, it's not on here. Well, what Ash found is that 75% of participants would initially give the answer that the group did. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that, and you might say, well, there's times where I know the right answer, but I don't want to look like the idiot in the room or something like that. So, that's kind of understandable. What's probably more interesting about the Ash studies is when Ash said, no, that's the wrong answer, it's line 2. for the most part, people went, I knew it. I knew you guys were wrong, because that then gives you the ability to gloat and say, I had the right answer. I just, you guys are fools or whatever. Okay. The interesting part is though 33%, okay, 1/3 of the participants would argue with Ash in favor of the group's decision. Okay. Even though the group's decision was absolutely wrong. Right. And in a way, this kind of mimics a lot of what we see in real life. For example, we can use religion. Within religion, 1/3 of people in a religion will become extremists. In political views, okay, where you have, what is it, ultra liberals and ultra conservatives, about 1/3 are ultra conservative and 1/3 are ultra liberal. When we look at any kind of view, despite any altering information or factual information that comes to them, they tend to stick to that original group perspective and even will defend it to its unarguable end. Okay. So, in a way, what Ash was kind of quantifying is this willingness for individuals, at least 1/3 of individuals, to continue to pursue the wrong answer in support of their group's position. Okay. So that was Ash. Now, this deals with informational and social influence, right? You're just making decisions based off of peers and those. What Milgram's did is he wanted to know about social influence, but he wanted to know about obedience, okay? Specifically, obedience to authority. What will people do if they're put in a situation where they're asked to do something that is consciously wrong, but because an authority figure is there saying, do it, how far will they take it? Okay. What Milgram really wanted to understand is that when he designed this study, and I think Zimbardo kind of explained this last Thursday, is when we look at, for example, Nazi Germany during World War II, okay, when he designed this study, all the psychiatrists and everything, just like what Zimbardo said last Thursday, only 1 or 2% thought people would go to a 450 volts to shock someone, because, as stated, that's sadistic behavior. And we know that about 1 to 2%, updated numbers is about 3 to 6%, are sadistic. Okay. But so the argument of Nazi Germany is, does that mean the population of the millions of Nazis, were they all sadistic? Because that's probabilistically impossible, given that at the time they only estimated 1 to 2%. So there had to be something else at play. And what Milgram argued is that maybe it is due to social influence. Okay. So what he did is he had individuals come into the lab. We'll put this guy up for a minute. And again, he's going to have a confederate who's going to act as a participant of the study. And they're going to come in with the actual participant. And he's going to tell them, he gave them their money up front so they could leave at any time with their money for coming to the experiment. And he flipped a cheating coin that's always going to either come up heads or another one that would come up tails. And it would always make it so that the confederate would be the learner and the participant will be the teacher. And it was advertised as helping scientists understand memory and learning in humans. Okay. So you're coming into this experiment thinking that you're going to forward science. You're going to tell us something about how human learning and memory work. Then you're going to end up being a teacher. Okay. In most of the situations, they're going to take the Confederate, put them in a little room. They're going to strap him up to all these devices and say that they're going to be electrocuted. Okay. And they're going to say, they're going to give them what's called anagram things where you have to match words. And what they tell them is that every time they get an answer wrong, you flip a switch on the shock box. Okay. The shock box had several switches, as you can see here, going from 0 to 450. Okay. Actually, it starts at 15 volts and it goes in increments of 15 volts up to 450. Okay. Um, the only person that actually gets shocked in the experiment is the participant because they give him a sample shock of about 45 volts just so that the participant kind of knew what that felt like and what it would be like. And then they go through the experiment. All right. And as they're going through these shocks, they can hear the guy say he has a heart condition, that he's in pain, he can't take anymore. For several shocks, it's completely silent. And even when they get up to 450 volts, if they got the 450 volts wrong, they made them do it 4 more times. So not only did you have to shock them 450, if they didn't get the answer right for 4 more times, you shocked them 4 more times. Okay. So this is a situation, and he wanted to know how many people would actually go to 450. And his results were is that about 67% of people in the study, on average, would go to 450 volts. Okay. But he did separate conditions. Whoops, we're not ready for you. He did separate conditions. He tested women in some, and he found that there was no difference between men and women. Um, he did do some different ethnic groups and whatnot, but it wasn't significant enough to really account for. Okay, it wasn't a fair distribution. So um, we do know that, so 67 and a half, however, there were some differences in some of the conditions. For example, if there's another participant there and they stopped, only 10% would go to 450 volts. If there was another participant that went all the way, not 900, but 90% would go all the way. What if instead of putting the teacher in another room, but they were sitting in front of you? What if we had you actually have to put their hand on the shock thing? Okay. While we find that even in that condition in physical proximity, about 45 to 50% would still go up to 450 volts. Okay. Um, but there are two questions that Milgram really wanted to get down to is what about that 1/3% of people who, when they asked the guy in the lab coat, hey, why can I leave? I want to stop this. And the lab coat guy would basically said, you agreed to this, please go on. I'll take responsibility, all of those kinds of things. Even despite that authority saying continue, what made about 1/3 of people stop? That's one question. And then in the other question I always get, what about today? Would people today do the same thing? Okay. Well, the first question has to do with people's experiences. Okay. A lot of the individuals who stopped the experiment were there were some electricians. There are people who experience severe electric shock during some time of their life. And so it seemed that with that 1/3, it wasn't a moral reasoning, it was an experiential reason. They knew what electric shocks could do, and so they stopped doing it. Okay. So that's what we know about the people who said, no, I'm not doing this anymore, is they had experience with the shocks. Now, what about today? Obviously, this is a highly unethical research. Um, and so today we can do what's called partial replications. Because what Milgram found is if you take someone up if you take someone up to 150 volts, 99% of people will go all the way to 450 volts. So in partial replications, we find that there's actually no difference between individuals today. In fact, the last replication was in 2019. There's really no difference in individuals today than there is in the 1960s. In fact, it was 67% in the 1960s. It's about 68 to 69% today. So we're actually going slightly up in our conformity to authority. So so this is kind of the issue with authority. So what are the kind of other applications? So I mentioned, I do want to just make an analogy with the shock box. Okay. When individuals were asked, like I asked you last Thursday, would you be willing just to shock someone with 450 volts? Uh, Almost everyone said no. They don't even want to participate in it. They're out of it. Okay. The key aspect of Milgram's study was the increments, starting with 15 volts and then going up to the next voltage, and progressing them up to that electric shock. Okay. And if we think about, again, awful social situations, and then even global situations, it never starts with 450 volts. Okay. The thing that I often think about is when I worked in the field of domestic violence and relationship violence, is that doesn't start with the abuse and the violence right away. Okay. I highly doubt, anyways, I hope I doubt. I guess there's about 1 or 2% that might say yes. I highly doubt that anybody would go out with someone if that someone said up front, by the way, I'm going to beat the hell out of you. I'm going to make it so you don't see your family, friends. I'm going to make sure I control your money. I'm going to make sure that you live a life of hell. You should know that. Let's go on a date. Okay. I hope, I hope whether you're a girl or a guy or anything in between, you kind of be like, no, we're not doing this. Okay. But relationship violence starts with the 15 volts. It starts with the name calling, the I don't like your friends, I don't like your family. Um, Geez, you're spending too much on that credit card. Maybe I better take care of your finances because you can't control it. Gosh, you're gaining a little weight. And it goes from 15, and each 15, it goes up and up and up to that 450 volts. Okay. And the reason I'm saying this, and sometimes it could happen in a couple days, and sometimes it might take 10 years. Okay. So there's no time on this. But the reason I'm saying this is when often you work with someone who has gone through abuse and you're like, why didn't you see those red flags? Why didn't you see that coming? Why didn't you know that was happening? Well, I hope now when you see that, you kind of can think of Milgram's studies, okay? Because each switch became easier and easier to do and easier not to recognize, okay? And we see the same thing again on the global scale that starts with some political idea. If we look at, for example, World War II, it started with our country is being ruined. There's people in our country that are making it so, oh, look, there's the Jews. And then it didn't start with extermination, it started with marking them, and then it started with taking away property. And so it just didn't go from let's round them all up and go kill them. It started with small 15-volt increments. Okay. So something to kind of think about when you think about the atrocities in the world, but even on the individual level, when people go through things like domestic violence. Okay. Now, what about that dog? I love this experiment because I get to prove that women are more evil than men. We got this. Okay. What about the dogs? So let me explain what these experimenters are going to do. The Milgram studies is about authority and authority of someone you don't know. But what about authority in which you have a relationship with the authority figure? Okay. Let's say your high school teacher or um, uh, back in or you were, freshman, sophomore year where you had a science class that had a lab and your instructor was there. Okay. So let's play this. So, I hope you saw your teachers, you had some type of I like that person kind of thing going on. And let's say we go about maybe 3/4 of the way through the semester. And instead of the authority figure being a guy in a lab coat, let's make it your teacher. Okay. And what your teacher is going to do is he's going to have you try to train a puppy dog. And just like the Milgram study, whenever he doesn't achieve something, you give him a little shock on the shocker, starts with 15 volts. And every time the little dog doesn't learn something, you give them an increasing amount of shocks up to 450 volts. Okay. Does knowing the authority figure make it different or not? And the answer is pretty starkly clear yes. Okay. Because in this situation, I will say no dogs were hurt. They were trained to actually react to the sound of the buzzer, and they do a little kind of shake thing. But but they were also trained not to do the things that they were being tried to train to do. Okay. And again, in the beginning of the study, they got to hug them, hold them, do all that kind of stuff, and play with them, and all of those things. So, who in this case would go up to 450 volts? Overall, it was about 75%. So we go from 2/3 to 3/4 of everyone would be willing to shock a dog. Um, this was originally done by Sheridan and King, and this is where I get to say women are more evil. 100% of the teen girls and college freshmen went all the way. You guys fried that puppy. Yeah. Yeah. How do you feel now? But only we went in Milgrams, we were 67%. Hey, we love dogs more. We only 54% for the guys. Evidence, scientific, evil, better, right? All right. No, I'm just yes. So in this study, yes, 100% of the girls did go all the way, but let's not excuse the guys. Because the uh, what is that? 46% who didn't shock the dog didn't stop for moral reasons. They didn't stop and say, this is wrong. I don't want to do this anymore. No, they did what guys do best. You gotta admit this. We made excuses. We say we would lie and say the dog learned the trick that it was supposed to trick. We'd say, oh, the battery went dead. Oh, the shocker doesn't work anymore. Not one of the young guys or college young people, boys, would say, this is wrong what you're doing to this dog. We need to stop. Let's not do this. Okay. And the other thing we do have to state is, again, this study um, uh, came under controversy because uh, this wasn't just simply doing this. I mean, the girls and the guys were crying. They were freaking out about doing the experiment and going through it. And so it wasn't that it was a non-affect thing. It's not that compassion wasn't there, right? But what was there is the relationship between the authority figure and the individual. And it seems when there is a known relationship, that we're more willing to comply when we see them as an authority figure. Okay. And this is usually when I start to say I want to put this in place later in the lecture. I usually give my example of the personality predicts is predicted by your foot. Okay. I had a group of students in one of my classes who just thought this was nonsense. They were very much, I make my own decision. No one controls me. No one thinks that makes me think anything. Okay. So I decided one day that I was going to kind of show how this works. And so on the way to class, I developed this bogus theory, and it was kind of cool. I think I could get this published in the parapsychology area. Okay. I came up with a theory that your foot, the size, the shape of your toes, the lines in the bottom of your foot predict your personality. So I think I said if you have a big toe, you're introverted. If you have a big small toe, you're no, your big toe was extroverted, small toe, if it's shaped this way, shaped that way, and it was just completely bogus. Okay. Gave the lecture, and the key thing was 2 weeks later, I gave a quiz. But on the quiz, I asked kind of a follow-up question. I asked the students how authentic and real they thought the foot theory of personality was. Okay. And again, just like we see here, and just like we saw with Milgram's, 75% of the students said absolutely. They either said mostly agree or agree. And only about that 25% said slightly disagree or disagree. Okay. So, two lessons in this. Okay. Authorities are not always genuine, and don't always believe what your professor says, because we might just be full of. So, with that, though, this is kind of that idea is sometimes we're willing to accept legitimate authority, your professor, school teacher, guy in a lab coat, and we're willing to accept the opinions of our peers even in the situation where our own moral and ideas and our self are not always in agreement. Okay. So, but let's look at this a little bit more. So he talked about, I'm not going to spend too much time about this because Zimbardo, he went over it in the video. He did the Stanford prison study. So Sharif and others, they did the whole peer thing. Milgrams did the authority. What the Stanford prison study wanted to know is what about systems? What about is it about systems that would allow people to disengage their morality in a sense? Okay, and so he took healthy boys that doing good in school. They were all Stanford students, all that kind of stuff. And he randomly divided by quarter which were going to be guards, which were going to be prisoners. He put the prisoners in kind of dress. He wanted to demasculate them. So he made them wear hair nets and put them in dresses that matched. And he dehumanized them by they couldn't use their name. They had to use a number. And then he had the guards who had things of authority. They had a little club. They had the glasses, the uniform. And he wanted to know with no rules other than keep the prisoners in line and don't physically, beat them up. What would happen? And he found that within 36 hours that the um, some of the prisoners started to have mental breakdowns and had to be medically released. Within 6 days, there was so much with the prisoner population and their mental states, he had to cancel the entire experiment, which was supposed to last 2 or 3 weeks. I can't remember right now. Because within 12 hours, the guards with no rules on their power started to abuse and take advantage of the prisoners. would degrade them, would make them do humiliating things like, well, you had some of the guys hump the floor or play like they were humping some of the other prisoners. They would do humiliating things like making them say, they're little girls, or they make them dance around doing the teacup songs and really just degraded them. Okay. And that happened within 12 hours. All right. And so his argument is this is what happens when systems don't have checks and balances. Okay. What I think is interesting when we leave the Stanford prison studies is it really highlights how people who have been in cults still believe in their cult leaders. People who have a belief system or something that is very harmful and painful for them, they can't leave it. Because with the prisoners, the interesting thing is when Zimbardo came in and said the experiment is over, the prisoners just went back into their cells and sat there because they didn't believe, they thought it was another trick. They thought that this is just another ploy, or that I'm not good enough to leave here. Because what's been proven to me is I'm a low life, even though they have no criminal histories, I'm a low life, I'm worth nothing, I can't go. And in some situations, they actually had to have the family members come pick them up and take them away. So that I think is a more interesting aspect of the prison studies beyond the violation of authority and power. But all right. So what do all of these studies say? If you want to get kind of grease that slippery slope, as Zimbardo said, again, mindlessly taking that first step, that 15 volts, dehumanizing of others, taking away their names and putting numbers, de-individuation of self, we all dress the same, blind obedience to authority, conformity to the groups, and passive tolerance of evil through inaction or difference. And that was one of the things with the prison studies, is there were guards who saw what were going on, but they decided not to do anything about it. They would just stand there and watch. So something to kind of think about. All right, for a few minutes, what are some real life examples of this? So well, this is actually an experiment. Um, if you have an ex you don't like in the ER, please don't tell anyone you got this from Dr. Peterson's class, okay? But we're going to set up an experiment. We're going to put a fake patient in a room in an ER. We're going to have a fake doctor, but we're going to have this serum, this medication that is commonly used to help sedate individuals, okay? Now, nurses are trained about measurement, they're trained about medications. I admire nursing students and people who have gone through it because you gotta learn a lot, okay, and know a lot about medications, medicines, all of that. And they're trained very well that the certain kind of medication you can't give over like 20 milliliters or whatever it is, okay? And so on this bottle, the experimenter actually enlarged the print saying, don't give over this amount. So, and something you should know about medical procedures is that in order to give a medication, you have to have a doctor's signature on something. Okay, you can't take their oral permission or anything like that. Okay, so we're going to have a fake doctor that's not even on the ER roster for medical doctors, and they're going to call this nurse, and he's going to say something like, "Hey, I'm 20 minutes away." I said 20 milliliters, so let's say, "Can you go give patient so and so 30 milliliters of this medication so that they're ready for the surgery when I get there?" Okay. So here we have a fake doctor, not even on the roster, and we know that giving over this amount of medication would kill someone or potentially kill someone. Okay. So what happened, you can kind of see it here. Actually, out of all of them, about 22 out of 23 nurses went to administer that lethal dose. Meaning, despite their knowledge, despite their education, despite not even knowing the doctor, despite all of those things, because it was a doctor that ordered the nurse followed the command. Okay. And what these type of experiments kind of shown is when you are in a rigid system, okay, even when people have all the knowledge in the world, when you're in a rigid, fixed system, you tend to comply to the authority that is there. And I don't know if anybody else here have sat in ERs for a long period and you actually watch the interaction between nurses and doctors, and you can see you don't question the doctor, right? And you can kind of watch that in the medical setting. And so in a follow-up survey, we actually found that about 47% of nurses report giving improper medication. Okay. So due to a doctor's order. So this is one example in a real life kind of situation where, because of the rigidity of the authority to subordinate relationship, it can then create, even despite knowledge and training and education, can make it so someone might do something that they might not otherwise do. Uh, Studies of plane accidents. This is another one where you have clear authority line. In a plane, the job of the first officer, it's actually in their job description, is to question the pilot and to call them when they feel they're doing something not totally correct. Okay. But we have found in about out of 27 plane accidents, in about 81% of them, the first officer chose not to question the pilot's actions, which in that sense then led to the plane accident. Okay. So again, here's another situation. It's your job to question the authority figure. But in this case, in 81% of the cases, because of the authority figure subordinate dynamics, the subordinate chose not to, which resulted in tragedy, as you would say. Let's look at some another real life. This happened from about 1999 to about 2003. I think there's like a Lifetime movie about it. I can't remember the name of it, but um, so let me set this up. This happened at fast food restaurants only. It happened across 32 different states and 68 situations. Um, and what would happen is that the person that's going to call this fast food restaurant knew pretty much one thing. He knew the manager, who the assistant manager was, and he knew that she was female and that she was young. Okay. That's the only things that he really knew. Okay. And so he would call the restaurant or the fast food joint and say, "Hello, well, he knew the manager. He'd ask for the manager or the supervisor or someone there, someone besides the assistant manager." Okay. And he would say that he was a police officer, an investigator, and they're investigating a series of thefts in their fast food chain. Okay. Now, this is the interesting twist in this, and it's a key point in the story. When he introduced himself as Officer so and so, after that, he said, "Please don't call me Officer so or so, call me Sir." Okay. So he made sure that the people actually never called him a legal authority name. He switched that immediately. Okay. The next thing you would say is your assistant manager, let's call her Megan. Megan is someone we suspect is stealing from your store. Is she there? And of course, yeah, she's here. She's almost, her shift's almost over, blah, blah, blah. And he says, you know what? I'm like 45, 50 minutes away. Um, can you have either you or one of your other employees take her to the back room and just kind of keep her there until I'm there? And then he would say, and take a phone back there so I can hear what's being said. Okay. So they do, being, thinking, oh my gosh. And of course, he would ask the assistant manager, Megan, are you stealing? And of course, what she's gonna protest, saying, no, no, I'd never do that. I'm not that kind of person. And he'd go, are you sure? I think you're lying. But to kind of shorten the story, he would then have one of the employees or the manager pat her down with her clothes on. Then remember the 15 volts, shoes off, socks off, shirt off, pants off, bra off, panties off. And since we're there, we should probably explore orifices. And hey, while you're there, why don't you have some fun? Okay. Now you'd think, I think most fast food employees are good, honest people. They work hard. I'm sure there are some deviants and stuff like that. Well, you'd think somewhere along the way, doing all of this and progressing through this, you'd kind of go, this is wrong, right? But this guy got away with it in 68 different situations, as it says, in 32 different states, where it would end in a sexual assault. Okay. Now, again, if you think about what he's doing, authority figure, someone of legitimate authority, you assume, people, workers in a fast food place, what do? You do work this. Everything is a conveyor belt. Everything is, you do what you do and you don't deviate from that. So you're now in a situation where everything is kind of factory like. And so doing something methodical is pretty normal in the fast food industry. You have person who probably has a very moral aspect, would never steal, and just wants to prove themselves innocent. Okay. And so you think about the situation, it's pretty ultimate. And I think the sad thing is that yes, they should, but in most of the cases, it was the managers who were fired. It was, and rightfully so, they did convict many of the men or people who assaulted the young women. But the guy who did the phone call, remember how he switched? Don't call me officer, call me sir. He's never been convicted. Even though he did it even across state lines, he has never received a federal charge for it. Because he wasn't the one that was physically and actively there engaging in the act of what was happening. Think about that and how influence doesn't even remember what I said at the beginning of this lecture. Real or imagined influence is all that it can take to get someone to engage in a behavior that would be counter to, I think, the person that they probably really are, right? So this is another example, kind of real life example. And then some other ones, and then I'll end with this indoctrination stuff and the social influence stuff, and we'll look at more positive stuff on Tuesday. But what about the question I started with Milgram? What about Nazis? Could there be Nazi America here in the United States? And a history teacher in a high school in Palo Alto actually did that with his world history class. He said, could you all be indoctrinated to being Nazis? And they all threw up their hands and said, absolutely not. Okay. And so he decided to do a simulation. All right. So what he did in the class of the next week, I think there's an after school special on this one. I don't know. I don't even know if they have those after school specials anymore. But for those who don't know, when we only had three channels, they had after school shows that kind of did stuff like this. So, anyways, my age. Anyways, so what did he do? He went in and he said, you know what, guys, you weren't put in this class because you were randomly put in my class versus another instructor's. You were put in this class because you guys have been identified by the school as no, as the smartest and brightest of the school. You guys are superior, and your intellect is so much higher than the rest of the school. Okay. Um, that was really the only real manipulation he did, other than giving them time at the end of school at class to converse, and but he constantly rewarded them on their intelligence, okay, and how great they were. By about mid-semester, they created signs. They started to create even what would be considered an SS or a Gestapo. So when they walked down the hallways, if anyone tried to interact with them, they'd have this Gestapo group that would kind of push them away. They started bullying and being aggressive towards non-world history students. They came up with their own creed that they would follow. Um, and they really basically created Nazi Germany in that high school. And the interesting part, the kind of end to this, the school teacher got fired, but not until he took it to the next level. He said, you know what, you guys have been here, your supreme leader will be here tomorrow. Meet me in the gym at 8 a.m. And when they went to it, he had this TV, and he took the towel off the TV, or the thing, and it was Hitler giving one of his speeches at Nuremberg. And he said, this is your supreme leader. So that messed with those students, but also he was dealing with some kids that got physically assaulted, and parents got involved. The teacher got fired, but it was an example of simple changes. In less extreme cases, there's also what are known as the colored-eyed experiments that were done with first, second, and third graders. And this is where the basic paradigm is can you create differences just based upon some physical attribute of an individual? Okay. And so, and I think I mentioned this in this class again, so I'll just go through it quickly. The teacher would come in and just basically say, hey, we found out that blue-eyed children were smarter and more intelligent than brown-eyed children. And absolutely, the blue-eyed students started to perform better. The brown-eyed students started to perform worse. And the blue-eyed students started bullying the brown-eyed students. They switched it, and you would think the brown-eyed students would be more compassionate. But no, they started bullying too. Okay. If you know anything about word politics, this is being played out, I think, in our world right now. Um, uh, as far as people who have been injured. Okay. And then the last example of blind obedience was an actual German battalion. Okay. There's a place in Germany that is surrounded by mountains, and you can only get to it with a road. There's just one single road that goes in and out of it. Back then, they didn't have planes that could fly into it or out of it. And so it was pretty innocuous for most of World War II. In fact, uh, Jews and Germans were living next to each other, working with each other, clear up until 1943. Okay, 2 years the war would be over. had no idea about the rest of Germany. Okay. But in 1943, Hitler becomes desperate, and so he starts recruiting elderly men and young men to become a battalion goes into this community. And first, the military people say, "Why are you talking with them? They are our enemy." And this is what we do with our enemy. Okay. Again, one day they were just neighbors, friends, uh, worked together. Within a week, we had about um, uh, shot by elderly family men. We had 38,000 of these elderly of the elder Germans in the community shot at point blank 38,000 of their neighbors within 3 weeks and deported over 45,000. And in that community, only 10% of them said, no, I'm not going to be involved in this. Okay. This example comes down to identity. Okay. Those Germans knew nothing about what was going on, really, but what they did know is that they were German. And being German means something. And if the German government and the German authority is going to come in and say, this is what it means to be German, then I need to be German because that's who I am as a human being. Okay. And this is a good example of how things like national identity, local identity can override sometimes our moral and ethical decisions. Okay. All right. These are all really fun and horrible examples of how sometimes we can be